To continue talking about the parts of our respiratory system, our trachea or our windpipe, on its anterior view, there are those cartilage rings that you see right here. This is hyaline cartilage, and they're only going to be found on the anterior view of the trachea, so you won't have any of the cartilage rings on the back. Having those cartilage rings can help keep the trachea open. And we want our trachea to stay open all the time so we can breathe. If your trachea collapses, then we are going to suffocate. Why don't we have any cartilage rings on the posterior view of the trachea? Because behind the trachea, posterior to your trachea, is your esophagus. And your esophagus is for food and fluid to pass through it. So when you swallow, your esophagus expands and pushes against your trachea. So not having any cartilage rings on the back view of the trachea will make it easier for the esophagus to expand and push against the trachea when we are swallowing. There are muscles that would hold those cartilage rings on your trachea, and those muscles usually contract when we are coughing. So those muscles contract so that when you're coughing, it would help with expelling the mucus out of your lungs. The trachea branches out, and right here where the trachea starts to split, we refer to this as the carina. So it splits and it branches into a right and a left main bronchus. You can either call it main bronchus or you can call it primary bronchus, and the plural would be bronchi. So actually, our right main bronchus is a bit actually shorter and wider compared to the left bronchus. Now, those two main bronchi, they go ahead and they branch out further into the secondary bronchi. Or you can call them the lobar bronchi. And you would notice that the more those bronchi branch, the more they get smaller and smaller in size. And so those secondary bronchi or lobar bronchi, they will branch out even further, getting smaller as you can see. And we call them our tertiary bronchi or our segmental bronchi. Those segmental bronchi, they branch even further, and they are going to they're going to branch into very tiny bronchi branches known as bronchioles. So those bronchioles are going to be very small, which will eventually even branch out even more into terminal bronchioles, and I'll show you a picture. And those terminal bronchioles are very, very small, like they are 0.5 millimeters in diameter. So when you look inside of our lungs, it's going to look like we have a huge tree inside there with all of those bronchi branches. Those bronchi branches are supplying the different lobes of our lungs. So our right lung has 3 lobes, a superior lobe, a middle lobe, and an inferior lobe. And you can see how those bronchi branches are supplying the different lobes of our lungs. The left lung only has 2 lobes, the superior lobe and the inferior lobe. And so sometimes when, if you have some of those bronchi branches, they are blocked. It doesn't mean that if you blocked, like, if someone has, let's say, a tumor, and the tumor caused some of those bronchi branches supplying the superior lobe of your left lung to get blocked. Does that mean your whole entire lung collapses? No, you can actually have only part of the lung collapsing. So only one lobe of the lung could start collapsing and not the whole entire lung. So if we look right here, we said that first you get the main bronchus, and then it branches out into the lobar, which then branches out into the segmental, which are your tertiary, and then from there it branches into the tiny bronchioles, which then branch out into the terminal bronchioles, etc. And you can see that the size is getting smaller and smaller. Now at the end, so here's the terminal bronchiole right here, which branches into those respiratory bronchioles. And at the end of those respiratory bronchioles, we have those clusters right here. They always use an analogy that those clusters look like grape cells clusters. So those sacs right here are known as the alveolar sac. So each one of those clusters is known as an alveolar sac. Within each sac, there are a bunch of alveoli. Um, alveoli would be plural, alveolus is singular. And this is where the gas exchange would go ahead and take place. So the gas exchange takes place within your alveoli. And we have about 300 million alveoli in our lungs. So let's go ahead and zoom in on those alveoli and talk about what they are, what they're made out of. So when we inhale the air and the air enters into our pharynx and from there into our larynx and our trachea, and then the air is going to pass down the bronchial branches. Eventually the air is going to make its way into our alveoli. Our alveoli are going to have the ability to inflate and deflate. So inflate when we are inhaling the air and the air enters into your alveoli. Those alveoli are going to inflate because now they're getting filled with air. And then when we exhale, those alveoli are going to deflate to push the air out of your lungs. So you would notice that on the surface of our alveoli, we have a bunch of elastic fibers to give your alveoli more elasticity so that it would have an easier time with the whole inflation and deflation process. By the way, when your alveoli deflate, it's not that they are going to deflate completely. There's still going to be some air within your alveoli, because if your alveoli deflate completely, that can lead to your lungs to collapse. And so we don't want that. So not all the air within your alveoli will actually be pushed out. Now your alveoli, this is where the gas exchange is going to take place. This is where the alveoli are going to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide between your alveoli and between your blood vessels. That's why you see that on top of the alveoli, there are a bunch of capillaries. And we know that capillaries are pretty thin and porous. To help with that exchange of the gases between your capillaries and between your alveoli. And your alveoli are super thin, so the gases are also going to exit and enter your alveoli pretty easily. And so when you inhale and all of that oxygen enters into your alveoli, you don't want the oxygen to stay in your alveoli forever. So that oxygen is going to exit your alveoli, and it's going to have an easy time exiting your alveoli because, as I said, the alveoli are very, very thin. And so the oxygen exits your alveoli and it's going to enter into the capillaries. And from there, it's going to go to your bloodstream. Now, carbon dioxide, right? When we exhale, we are exhaling mostly carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide is going to also be exchanged. So the carbon dioxide is going to exit your capillaries, enter into your alveoli, and from there, your alveoli will deflate, pushing that carbon dioxide out of your body. And if we remember the whole pulmonary circulation, our pulmonary arteries are going to bring deoxygenated blood to your lungs so that your lungs would go ahead and oxygenate that blood, which will eventually, that oxygenated blood is going to the tiny capillaries are going to take those that oxygenated blood and send it down your venules, eventually into your pulmonary vein, back into your heart, so that your heart would pump that oxygenated blood into or to the rest of your body. If we look inside of our alveoli, we would notice that there are a bunch of pores within each alveolus. Now, those pores are not for the gas exchange because, as I said, the whole entire alveolus is really thin, allowing the oxygen and the carbon dioxide to enter and exit your alveoli pretty easily. So if those alveolar pores are not for gas exchange, what are they for? Those pores are going to help the air move from one alveolus to another alveolus. And so the thing is, you want the pressure in each alveolus to be exactly the same. And so having those pores allowing the air to kind of move easily from one alveolus to another alveolus ensures that the pressure within each alveolus is going to be the same. And that's pretty important because that helps equalize the pressure throughout your whole entire lung. Because if you do not have equal pressure within your alveoli, your lung is going to collapse. So if we look inside of our alveoli, we have type 1 cells, and those type 1 cells are going to make the wall of our alveoli. And our alveoli, they're made up of a simple squamous epithelial tissue. And it's helpful that it's made out of a simple tissue because, as we said, we don't want it to be too thick so that it would be easy for the oxygen and the carbon dioxide to be exchanged between your alveoli and between your bloodstream. So if this is the alveolar wall right here, and so here, this is the inside of your alveolus. And then here we have the capillaries on top of our alveoli. Because that wall is super thin, the oxygen inside of your alveolus will have an easy time passing out of your alveolus into your bloodstream. And then the carbon dioxide found within your bloodstream is going to leave your capillaries and enter into your alveolus. And then from there, your alveolus will deflate, pushing that carbon dioxide out of your lungs when you basically exhale. There is another type of cell within our alveolus known as the type 2. And so those type 2 cells, they're pretty important because they're going to secrete a surfactant. Consistency-wise, that surfactant is like soap. And so you're going to have that surfactant coating every single alveolus. So each alveolus is going to be coated with that surfactant. That surfactant is actually going to prevent your alveoli from collapsing. Because, as we said, when the air is going to make its way into the alveoli, that air got filtered right when it passed into your nose. So it got filtered, it's warmed up, it's humidified. So that humidified air entering into your alveoli, if we didn't have that surfactant, that humidified air is actually going to collapse your alveoli. Think of your alveoli as a pretty thin piece of tissue. And you go ahead and you spray water on that very thin piece of tissue. What's going to happen to the tissue? It's going to collapse. And so basically, if we use that analogy to what's happening inside of your lungs, you're sending humidified air into your alveoli. Without having that surfactant, your alveoli are just going to collapse like that piece of tissue. That's why when premature babies are born and they haven't produced that surfactant yet, they are going to be they're going to have to be connected to ventilators because without that ventilator, their lungs are just going to collapse because they haven't started producing that surfactant yet. So one more time, type 2 cells are the ones that are going to produce that surfactant, and that surfactant is going to coat each single alveolus. We also have a bunch of macrophages inside of our alveoli, and those macrophages are phagocytes. So in case, even though we did filter the air, but in case there are still some pathogens in that air that you've just inhaled, those macrophages are going to help eat up those pathogens. If those macrophages die, which they will eventually, they're going to die, are they going to stay within your alveolus? Are they going to stay within your lungs? And the answer is no. Eventually, those macrophages are actually going to be they're going to exit your alveoli, and the cilia within your respiratory tract, it's actually going to push them out, and it's going to push them into your throat. And we're just going to swallow them. So we usually swallow about 2 million macrophages per hour. This image right here shows the lungs within your pleural cavity in your thoracic region. And so we have the layers, the pleural layers protecting our lungs. We've got the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. And you would notice that between the pleural layers, there is actually a cavity, and that cavity is usually filled with some pleural fluid. That fluid helps prevent the parietal pleura and visceral pleura from frictioning and rubbing against each other. As we said, your lungs are inflating and deflating all the time, so you don't want to have any friction between the pleura layers. And so that fluid is going to help lubricate, and that fluid is also going to help keep the layers pretty close to each other and not separate. So right here you do see that cavity that I was just talking about, that pleural cavity, and it's going to be filled with some fluid. And as I said, that fluid is going to prevent those two layers, the parietal layer and the visceral layer, from rubbing against each other. Now you would notice that underneath or at the base of our lungs, we have this muscle right here known as our diaphragm muscle. Your diaphragm muscle is actually pretty important when it comes to inhaling and exhaling the air. Notice how the diaphragm is right here pretty close to our lungs, and so when we inhale, that diaphragm needs to actually, it's going to push down so that it can give room to your lungs to expand. So when we look at this image right here, when we inhale the air, your chest cavity is going to expand. And so those muscles right here, our intercostal muscles, our external intercostal muscles are going to contract, helping your chest cavity expand, right? Because now your lungs need as much room as possible. So your chest cavity is going to expand. And what's going to happen to your diaphragm, the diaphragm is actually going to push down to give more room for your lungs to expand. When we exhale the air out of our lungs, you would notice that your external intercostal muscles right here by your ribs are actually going to relax, and so your chest cavity is going to deflate, and the diaphragm is actually going to move back up. So the diaphragm is going to move back up because now you don't need as much room. So when we inhale, the diaphragm gets pushed down, and when we exhale, the diaphragm gets pushed back up.